speech is not only hot off the press, it's not off the press, it's still being composed. And hoping to have some help with that speech tonight. But I am saying that one of the things that made them so interesting as thinkers, and still does, is that they have dangerous workplaces. And there's no missing that. There's certainly no missing that in the last part of the 19th century. So that they are people who rarely get a very long spell without having to recognize mortality. And I start, one of the stories that I'm telling in the speech is about the cowboy Charlie Siringo, who wrote probably the first cowboy autobiography or narrative. And he was from South Texas, from Matagordo, and his racial attitudes were insufferable and reprehensible, and so on. And I mean, he was a kid, white kid who grew up in the midst of the Civil War. Started when he was maybe 5 or 6 years old. He was identified with Confederate. So I understand how Charlie Siringo, I think I understand a lot of how Charlie Siringo got his attitudes. So I'm starting this off with Charlie Siringo because he was often at a cliff edge about to lose his life. And in maybe the two worst situations like that, his life was saved by an African-American fellow cowboy. So he was, when he was just getting started as a cowboy, Charlie Siringo he lassoed a steer, and the steer headed into some woods and brush. The steer went one side of a tree. Charlie Siringo's horse went the other side of the tree. Everything fell apart. And he ended up very tangled. He ended up tangled in the rope. His horse was down. The steer was well, it was an African-American cowboy named Jack who saved him from an incident like that. So when I read that in Charlie Siringo's autobiography, I think, were you changed, Charlie Siringo? If you were just, he was in an impossible situation and had someone not come to his aid, there would have been, this book has to be grateful to the African-American cowboy Jack who saved the author. But I just ended up coming to a halt on that page. I've read this, I don't know what, 14 times, but this was the time I came to a halt and I thought, well, the stories are intertwined. Charlie Siringo is with us because a Black man saved his life. Why are we struggling over these? Are we going to do this kind of history or that kind of history? The people of the past were all intertwined. So that is my current, you're getting a little preview of what the good souls at the Elko Cowboy Poetry Gathering are going to get soon. So I'm just going to tell that story and say, I went wild in the last few days of trying to think, did that have any effect on Charlie Siringo? Not that I can tell. There's nothing in his, he could be very mocking and clearly a person who believed that white people were superior and so on. So how come somebody can save your life and you're not changed? That's something that I've been asking Charlie Siringo. And then also just that how completely intertwined the history of cowboys are. I mean, the notion that we would have African-American history over here, white people's history over here, Mexican-American history over there, the cattle business, the cattle really don't care. The cattle are not paying attention to ethnicity, so it gets all swirled up. So how did we get so separated and divided in our thinking about history? And how come Charlie Siringo didn't undergo a conversion? That happened to somebody else, and another African-American man, Lige, saved his life on another occasion. So how could you have that happen and not be a different person? You're a minister. Carroll, help me with this. What do you think?
Yeah, off mute? Yeah, I'm off. Yeah, I'm a minister and I'm, also a lawyer. And I think they both require some type of historical reference points when you're actually doing either one of those, either in looking at case law or, preparing a sermon. It requires that you get in the head of people who died long before you to really understand the Bible in its proper context most of the time. I was going to talk about this or approach this differently, and then January 6th happened. And so it's naturally changed my approach to this. And by the way, Emma, thanks for saying I'm a cool guy. I would think if I had a teenage daughter, she would call me a cool guy. So I appreciate that. a whole lot. I just had a birthday 3 weeks ago, and so I'm feeling a little older, but to know I'm older, but a cool guy still,
Yeah.
warms my heart in many ways. But back to what I was saying, um, January 6th changed this whole thing for me slightly and how I'm approaching this because, the history of democracy in this country is also tied in with the history of the American West expansion in this country. You can't separate the two of them, especially when you look at the words of Horace Greeley when he said, "Go west, young man." Although not particularly intended for African American folks, I mean, it is still the story of African American folks. I mean, Horace Greeley was trying to talk to the second and third sons of Eastern gentry and the working class of the East Coast, who really didn't have any room to grow economically or grow socially, but yet they could come west and create their own place and create their own mark on the earth, especially the second and third sons of these great East Coast families. When it comes to African Americans post Civil War and how we look at that statement, "Go west." For African Americans, go west meant is you could get away from the entanglements of the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction era South by moving to places or in and around Denver. Just outside of Denver, up in Will County, you have a place called Deerfield, which is an African American homestead. All throughout Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas, you have places that were African American homesteads. The most famous of which is probably outside of Tulsa. What was it? Greenwood, I think, was the name of it before it was absorbed by Tulsa, where African American folks created their own political environment, their own economic environment, their own social and cultural environment, and it grew to such a point that it became a threat to the white folks in Tulsa. But to get back, and so we have this long, complicated history between African Americans and other non-white groups as well with the West and how we interact with the West. And Dr. Limerick's story about the white cowboy, he was saved twice by Black cowboys during the course of his career, and how that didn't change his racial views. It doesn't shock me at all, because throughout American history, it is a story of African Americans doing work to save this democracy or creating safe spaces for democracy, but yet still being treated like second and third class citizens. All we have to do is look at the 9th and 10th Cavalry, who by themselves have a complicated history in the West because of their interactions with indigenous people. So they're not without any type of blood on their hands, but the fact that there would be no West without the 9th and 10th Cavalry and their work post-Civil War is important to note. Or the fact that you have Bass Reeves, who was a U.S. Marshal in the Oklahoma Territory, or in fact, in the rodeo, you wouldn't have a rodeo without Bill Pickett, at least one major rodeo event you wouldn't have without Bill Pickett, or the other, African role in creating the West. Even the city of Pueblo, without, African Americans in the early West wouldn't exist. So it's a question about, in the West, probably more than any place else, is how do you create a multiracial democracy in this new place? And the West was probably the first place to have to experience that outside of the South. But in terms of without the tradition of slavery, the West was one of those places. So, I mean, I've been actually in the past few days getting ready for this, thinking about that a lot, and what does that mean, and what does that mean for today? And in terms of the stock show, and I'll close with this, at least this section of what I'm talking about. One of the things that we've talked about at the stock show, at least from the board, is that as we create this new complex, it's important that the new stock show complex tells the story of all peoples of the West, not just quote unquote the cowboys. And that's even a problematic subject in and of itself, defining who the cowboys were. But what you're going to see with our partners at CSU and History Colorado and folks like that is that we're going to tell a fuller story about the people who were part of the West. and make sure that it's an accurate narrative and not just this very, this very narrow narrative about who were the people who created the American West. Because oftentimes you get this idea that it was just a bunch of white guys who showed up and decided they were going to create the American West, and that's just far from true.
Yes, and I have what I have thought, I'm really happy about being a Western American historian because it is so complicated, and it is never possible to say, well, we've got it sorted out. I like that fact that we're always challenged and always having to think. And my friend, when my friend Quintard Taylor wrote his book about African Americans in Seattle, he, of course, he didn't just write about white people and black people. He wrote, there's one chapter where there's hardly any white people in there, but there's none because it's a chapter about African Americans and Japanese Americans and their relations. And to me, when I saw that in my friend Quintard's book, I just thought, well, that's refreshing. Instead of this thing where white people are at the center and everybody's in relationship to them, I thought that's what I really like about the West, is that the relationships between this wonderful young protege, Daniel Grant, who's writing his book now, it's his dissertation on Yuma, Arizona, where the Yuma or Quechuan Indian people had a reservation, and African American settlers came into that area and settled, started farming, and then the Colorado River, this is a very Western piece of challenge there, the Colorado River changed its course. And so the area where the African American settlers were was suddenly, because of the change of the river, was part of the Indian reservation. So then you have black settlers who are now, because the river changed, intruders in Indian lands. And that's what I think about Western history. You think, I didn't see that coming. I didn't think I would ever have to ponder, again, where the white folks are pretty peripheral to that story, and as a relationship between two oppressed groups, two groups that are, just to me, one of the greatest things that we're trying to figure out. And I will say the young scholars, and there are young scholars in this group, so take this on, kiddos, because kiddos, I shouldn't say that, sorry, that's not a respectful term, but young folks, could you take this on? Because putting together the history of slavery and the history of the conquest of Indian people, it seems with specialization, we have plenty of people who do one subject, and then we have people who do the other subject, but recognizing how intertwined the conquest of Indian people and the enslavement of black people, those are not separate stories. And sometimes that comes up with the Cherokee freedmen who were slaves of Cherokee Indian people in the American South, and who then were part of the migration, part of the Trail of Tears. And the question, the struggles over their status in the tribe, that's been very difficult. So there's just, I guess what I'm saying is there are wonderful moments where the white folks are not the center of attention and needn't be. And the full complexity of the West comes in these moments when people who have, they have more in common as oppressed people, but that does not mean that that's going to make them friends or make them collaborative or take part in a harmonic relationship. Now, I'm going to say something that I think will just be an interesting thing for us all to test, that I think that for all that I just told several stories about conflict, I guess, but the notion that we have been peoples in conflict, certainly true, but we've also been peoples in collaboration and common enterprise and so on. And I think with, like, for instance, with white people and Indian people, I think there was more trading, more conversing, more intermarrying, more reproducing children than there was armed combat. Those the battles, the massacres, those register in our attention. But the fact that people are in lots of ways actually interested in each other in the 19th century West as well as today, we don't really have any coverage of that. We're lucky when someone like Charlie Siringo was willing to put it in his book. My life was saved. Oh, back man. But those kinds of moments where people are not, and boy, Speaker, I certainly get your point about the So an African-American man saved a white man. Well, in fact, African-American people have saved the nation over and over and over again with their labor and contributions. So I don't want to overdo that, but I just would like to put forward the hypothesis that we, for good reason of the records, we pay more attention to the conflict than we do to the what might actually be a more I'm not going to say it's inspirational, but a more uplifting story than the stories that we hear of the violence and the sometimes the, not to say anything against lawyers, but that sometimes the conflict just goes directly from battlefields into courtrooms in Western history, which is an interesting thing in itself. So what do you think about this notion that there's actually more cooperation and collaboration and getting to know you kinds of activities going on among the groups of the West from the 19th century to the present? And does that seem like what might be the point of view of a white liberal? Should we think that maybe that came from a white liberal's tormented mind and deserves some skeptical treatment? If I said, oh, I so hope that the National Western Stock Show will really put those stories of cooperation and collaboration front and center, what would you say to that?
And I think there was more collaboration than we probably give folks credit for. But when you read the stories of Black cowboys and and of Native peoples in the American West, it's a complicated story of collaboration. On one hand, you read the stories of some of these Black cowboys, and I wish I could turn around on my bookshelf and grab my books, grab this one book in particular, where they talk about how one of the good things about being in the West was that if you were a Black cowboy, for the most part, you were treated based on your work, as opposed to in the South where your race was firsthand. But at the same time, they still suffered from segregation and discrimination. So it was a both and kind of thing that had to be taken into account to a large degree. I think part of this narrative about the conflict in the between peoples in the American West is driven a lot by popular culture, and always has been, because our understanding of what the West was is very much driven by John Wayne movies, for example, and this idea of the manifest destiny. And I'm not sure if they still even teach manifest destiny, that the West was this wild and woolly, untamed, uncivilized place, and that if not for white folks moving into this wild place, there would be no American West to think of, to speak of. And so I see where you're coming from. I'm just not prepared to fully embrace this idea that, there's a lot of that. We had a lot of intermarriage, yes, but I'm not ready to embrace the idea that it was less violent than given credit for. I'm not ready to embrace that yet, because the very notion of how we moved into the West is very much perpetuated on this notion that at its core, I think, is probably racist and nationalist, which is manifest destiny. And even when let's just take for granted, let's just accept, as a point of discussion, that our understanding of the West is very much driven by these old school Western movies. They actually, on purpose, I believe, did not deal with the vast majority of non-white people who were actually out West already. And I only can think of a few Western movies that ever really dealt with it. John Ford's movies dealt with it. So probably his best movie, but yet less talked about movie, Sergeant Rutledge, about a Black man who was part of the Buffalo Soldiers, who was accused of a crime. And John Ford did this movie in the 50s and the 60s, and it was sort of a nod to what was going on in the civil rights movement. I think movies like that came closer to talking about the complicated nature of peoples and their relationships in the West than anything else that we've ever talked about or seen dramatized.
So I want to cover around the stock show a little bit more in a moment, but I also, as I understand it, you were part of a as I understand it. But you have done some very good-hearted things, and you're writing for the Denver Post, Unite America. You have done some extraordinarily good-hearted, made overtures to bring out the better angels in people's conduct, and that's brought some angels out and some not, I guess. But I'm wondering, given how you have really gone forward on quite a number of occasions of making statements and invitations to people, to your fellow Coloradans, to behave better with each other and to engage. I mean, Unite America, the country that our common concerns about party and so other stuff like that. I'm just wondering, what would you have? What's going to happen in the stock show exhibits? We'll use that because that's the great case study we have before us that might produce better behavior in Westerners. Or is that an agenda that we should or shouldn't be pursuing? Should we just look at the history and let people draw their own conclusions? Or is there a way that the really exciting opportunity with the stock show that can present history in a way that might actually make people, not make people, but invite them to be better members of a human community?
And I certainly hope there is. I mean, there was one idea I had that kind of financially is not viable, which was to move the Barney Ford House or the Justina Ford House to the stock show property, to drive more people to the Black America West Museum exhibits. But that's just not viable financially at this point. But in terms of what I understand, in terms of the educational component, there is a desire to present Western history, American Western history, in a much more broad context and narrative that would challenge how people perceive how the American West was. I don't know what that looks like yet. And no one's there yet because we still have like 3 years of, well, there's some work being done on it, but no one's really settled in on it. And I think CSU and History Colorado are taking a lead on that. And I have great faith in them and their educational programming in that regard, because we do need to tell the story differently. My whole thing that I've been on lately, I don't want to say lately, but that I'm constantly on, is that you can't tell the story of America and you can't tell the story of the American West. I believe that part of the problem that we have with how we are dealing with democracy right now, or our democratic problems that we're having, is that despite all these touch points where we've done good stuff and we've done bad stuff, we've had to trail tears, we've held all these different things, no one's really sat down and had a long, intense conversation where we told hard truths and had difficult conversations. And so we just keep repeating stuff over and over again. And I hope through my writing and the work that I do to actually engage people in these conversations, in these very difficult conversations that we need to have. If not, our democracy is for naught, the way we tell history is for naught. And I can tell you, and I can point to an example where people struggle with actually addressing the harder parts of our history. Because we want to look at the good part of our history, but where people, this whole controversy over 1619 and the slave trade. And as you remember, Governor Bill Owens said he was no longer going to subscribe to the New York Times because of it. And I argue that, the reason he did that, and if he said that, and there's nothing I haven't said to Bill, is that it goes counter to the narrative that we want to hear about us as Americans. This idea that we're the land of the free and the home of the brave, where everybody has equality of opportunity. And I think that's what we all want. But when you look at the American West and you put it in context of, the arguments about 1619, it makes us very uncomfortable to have these conversations about how people had to be displaced to create the American West, or how we committed, I don't know any other way to say it. We did mass killings to create parts of the American West. We almost brought buffalo to the extinction to create the American West. That was all bad. We need to have that conversation. But the other part that's positive is that we at least created a place where marginalized folks to some degree could feel like they could make a place for themselves in the world without interference, without racism, without bigotry, and without discrimination. We're partially successful with that, but we still need to talk more about, you know, and I'm normally more like hopeful, but I think the last 3 weeks have kind of like, kicked me in the butt a little bit. But I'm still hopeful, but I'm hopeful in the sense that we can make progress if we're willing to use this as an inflection point to actually have these hard conversations.
I remember a moment, I guess it was when I was writing this book, The Legacy of Conquest, where Richard Butler had his Aryan Nations operation in Idaho, and there were various white supremacy groups around northern Idaho in particular, and I was reading an article about them, and I thought, this is the language of plenty of white folks in the mid-19th century. This is not what the Aryan Nations people were saying about the superiority of the white race and its powers and its right to dominate. And I thought that's kind of almost is bordering up on direct quotation from certain Western settlers. So that was not a comfortable thought of thinking that these groups actually were quoting. I don't know if they were quoting, but they sounded directly like that. And I'm wondering if this is going to be a hopeful angle that younger scholars are taking, or maybe it just fragments and scatters it. I do want to get back to how the last 3 weeks of, last 5 years, it's very unsettling and really hard to get your footing on this. But meanwhile, there's a bunch of younger historians, well, 3 or 4, and one of them, Drew Eisenberg at University of Kansas, has said, basically, do we know that the settlers of the 19th century West, that they were actually, did they use the phrase manifest destiny very often? Was that actually a term that was on their minds? And then he has a couple of proteges. Tommy Richards has a new book called Breakaway Americans. And what they are finding is that it is hard to see much use of the term manifest destiny among the settlers. It was a term that John O'Sullivan used in a feisty moment with kind of Democratic politics, fighting Whigs and so on. But it doesn't seem like that phrase took. And what they are finding instead is that many Western settlers, this is Tommy Richards' book in particular, many Western settlers didn't care if the United States came with them. So there was interest in having a Pacific Republic. Wanted land, they totally wanted land, they wanted the Indians controlled, they wanted all of that, but they also wanted to have a government that was modeled on the United States, but they didn't care whether it was the United States or not. So it's been a really interesting set of studies to have this recognition, apparently, that quite a few Western settlers were not particularly nationalists and thinking they didn't think, oh, we are the soldiers, the civilian soldiers marching westward for the nation. They thought, can we get land title? And obviously the white settlers in Texas were part of that. Mexico, okay, we'll do that if we can get land title here. So I don't know if that's going to be something. These studies really have, only one of them has been published as a book yet. So if I hadn't run into these people and known them personally, I wouldn't even know about their work. But I wonder, will that help if we find out that white American settlers were really not a particularly unified group, and they certainly white settlers could fight among themselves. They could certainly quarrel with each other in a very animated way. So is there going to be something where instead of this monolith of a nation moving west, if we find out it was more fragmented and not a coherent, thought through movement, will that be better, do you think? Will that give us more of a sense of we don't inherit from a monolith of taking over the continent? So I'm looking for my hope wherever I can find it. And so that I'm just wondering how that holds.
I'm generally a hopeful person, and I don't think that we can, and I don't want to give the impression that I think that all white folks in the 19th century West were a monolith. And that's for me. I don't think anyone is. And I think we always have to look at the nuances and the gray areas because it's always more complicated. It's just that question of how much energy you want to give to looking at the nuances. Most of us rather have a big picture thing we want to look at. That's how we develop biases, because it keeps us from having to deal with nuance in our life. So we create these stereotypes and these biases. So yeah, I think it's important to look at the fact that, maybe not all of the white folks who came out west had nationalist tendencies, and I think it's probably true that they didn't. But at the same time, I think it may be true that, there was a vast majority who still saw themselves as being superior to people who weren't white. Because there's some research on and study on the creation of Pacific Northwest, Oregon and Washington in particular, where they wanted to create their own white state. I believe centered around Oregon.
Yeah.
And so we have to talk about those stories as well. And which is why, in my impression, and my half jokingly, I say this is why modern day Oregon, Washington, and Idaho happen to have a high percentage of white militia groups still. But I also would argue that the people who went west still brought their biases with them from wherever they came from. And you have to take that into account. I'm not going to say they were all bad people. It's just a question of, in this nation, we've never dealt with how the West evolved in a very serious manner as part of our national narrative. And that's just one component of our national narrative we haven't dealt with. There's a lot of components of our national narrative that we haven't dealt with, and that we have to deal with. I would say politically, where we are today is informed by 19th century American Western people, or Westerners in the 19th century, is that in the Rocky Mountain West, we have really still have a really strong libertarian strain in both parties. When you look at, Colorado and New Mexico and Utah, and Utah got to put an asterisk by, Arizona and Montana and South Dakota and North Dakota, all those places for a long time had a very strong libertarian strain to it. That influenced politics above and beyond your typical two-party politics.
I'm just, this is part, it's the January 6th, when we get to audience involvement, which I guess will soon be really great to know more about how the January 6th is striking young folks as I think it is very hard. It's harder for me to have a tale and if nation, a little bit larger for Biden and a little bit less for Trump, but if that's that divided, how will we ever deal with crossing the street together, much less a full history reckoning? It seems, or would in fact the full history reckoning give us better positioning to say, well, these conflicts and problems started a long time ago, so we must we didn't create them, we inherit them, let's work together on them. I guess I'm just wondering what would the dealing with part, and I'm sorry, I'm realizing that what I'm really saying is you were a legislator, and I have never been near that. I am the queen of armchair quarterbackism. I am really the armchair quarterback of all time. I'm just on the side there watching that. You have been in the fray of making the policies and arriving at the decisions and voting on. You've been at the legislature. Is that okay? You inherit historical problems in the legislature, then you deal with them. So, and I know you're not. By the way, I'm not a fan of term limits. I'm just going to say right now that I'm not thinking that was the best thing that ever happened to Colorado to have you term limited out here. But what does the dealt with part mean now?
Yeah, my mental health is okay with term limits at this point. It was good for me. But I use words like dealt with a lot, simply because my very nature is to attack a problem. So I'm fairly aggressive in that nature, in that if there's an issue, let's just deal with it. Let's put all our cards on the table And I think we're full. I don't think we're as divided 50-50 I don't think we're as divided as a nation as people try to make us out to be. I still think there is, and I'm actually paid to work in this space where I try to find people who are pragmatic and thoughtful and want to work together towards finding solutions. I'm finding that there are far more people who want to be in that space that are pragmatic and problem solving oriented and want to find a common space for us to deal with, to deal with these things. There are a whole lot of folks. I think it's the way we ask questions a lot of time in polls, and I deal with a lot of polls. And when they said, "Are we going right track, wrong track?" Or I mean, you got to look at this, how these questions are drafted and who's drafting these questions. So still have great faith in our democratic experiment that will survive this, because we've survived worse things, to be honest with you. And where we got to on January 6th is not solely the result of 4 years of Donald Trump as president. I mean, I'm writing a column right now for a national organization where I'm talking about how for the course of our history as a nation, we flirted with popular authoritarianism a lot. This is not the first time we flirted with it, played footsies with it, even, for a second got in bed with it until we realized that being an authoritarian was not a good look, nor were they good cuddle partners. We didn't have things like the Alien Seditions Act. President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. You can go on and on and on. The House American Eugene McCarthy with the House American Un-American Activities Committee. We've flirted with this a lot, and so this is not new. But I think what is new and makes this a more interesting thing, if you listen to the language of some of the leaders of this, is that some of it is directly some of the more aggressive tones now are directly in response to Barack Obama. Demographics of this nation are changing. You have more people of color and LGBTQ plus people making their voices heard. It's a different thing. And some people would argue that we've only been a multiracial, multicultural democracy since 1965 or so, which was when the Voting Rights Act was passed, or when the right to vote for people of color was solidified. And so it's interesting. But I will also point to the fact, when we talk about the West, to kind of stay on topic a little bit, the West should take credit for some incredibly progressive things back at the beginning in the 19th century and early 20th century. From when women's suffrage, it's a Western thing. It started here. Colorado, its earliest constitution, it was inclusive in terms of languages that things had to be printed in. That was a good thing. Barney Ford, had an incredible influence on how things happen in Colorado. So you look at the West. In fact, one thing that most people don't know, I only found this out in the middle of some legal research. There was one Western state, I believe, at least when it used to be a Western state, I think it was Kansas. The first same-sex marriage happened in Kansas in the late 1800s, before Kansas went off to do Kansas things. So the West has traditionally been somewhat more progressive in terms of pushing back against the status quo than the rest of the country. I mean, it's only a modern. I mean, I think the modern notion of the West has made it much more conservative in terms of social issues. But that's kind of where I am on. Those are some of the things I've been thinking about post January 6th.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really happy to hear those things, and I agree with you that the really sizable percentage of the population, maybe especially in Colorado for different reasons, that just says, can we solve problems? Can we not? We really need to be shouting and so on. I think there's a lot of that. And I'm wondering, because of your religious affiliation and professional role there, is religion in the West, is that going to be more help? Might be in other parts of the country. Is there any reason to think that? I mean, I understand that recognize that the West ended up with the largest percentage of people who claim no religious affiliation, the nuns, as they're called, but N-O-N-E instead of N-U-N. So, uh, so what, as a person in a leader in a faith community, where do you see, and I'm doing this partly because we have a wonderful friend, and Jeff and Becca Hunt too would join me in this, that Jan Ships is a woman who is a historian of Mormonism. She's not Mormon herself, but she always pushed us in Western history. She was always after me for getting to talk about religious history. So I am responding a little, talking enough about religious history on any occasion. And since we have you with your background, and I should say, just to say something about these times and how we respond to them, I've never joined a church in my life. Never joined a church, but I joined a church on August 9th of this year. So what that says about the tensions of our times and things that we can be brought to. I mean, I say that partly because of the dreadful notion that we can't change. Once we have done something for decades, we won't change that. So I think it's a pretty interesting thing that I actually did. The church was really nice. I've never been baptized. And so because it's all virtual, they really should not have admitted me because I'm supposed to be baptized, but they've been nice about fudging the rules a little bit on that. So I am really struck by, having gone through my little, I guess it was a conversion, how the Sunday services are really a place to breathe deeply and to think, well, there's a framework here that is the urgency and the sense of approaching a cliff edge. I mean, all of the things that you said about the things that have gone wrong in the United States before that we have recovered from, something about a Sunday, a well-delivered Sunday service just makes me think, well, yeah, this is something we might. So anyway, this is a very long-winded way of saying, would you speak a little bit about where you see the places where, yeah, please go ahead.
I was going to say, Clark made a good point about the cowhands and the cowboys being kind of marginalized. And I'm going to use that as from the rest of Western society or rural society in the West. I'll use that as a stepping off point to answer your question. Yes, they were. I mean, they weren't necessarily your typical church goers, but the church in the West, it played a particular role in the nascent urban centers and the little town centers that came up in the West, in the sense that it was a place for socialization. It was a place where culture was created. It was a place where community had a focal point where they can meet once a week, where people would come in from wherever they were and have those interactions with each other, those social interactions. I'm not sure how important the theological aspects were to that, and that's actually true today for Christianity. There's still a question of how much of church is cultural or how much is theological. As an ordained Baptist preacher, I like to think it's more theological than cultural, but I'm also, my mother raised me to have some common sense. So I think cultural in the sense that it's where you had to go. I mean, it was an important part of community relationships. And it also, I think, based on some of my readings about rural churches and, Baptists who were out west and United and Methodist folks who were out west and so on and so forth, there was no quote unquote evangelical movement, or even there hadn't even been a Pentecostal movement yet. It wasn't a thing. So the theology was probably pretty milquetoast. There was not this talk about abortion was bad and this, that, and the other thing. It was very much based on what I've read, traveling preacher who came through at least bring the community together once a month. Very few places were large enough to have a full-time minister and to have more than one church. So that's a different conversation. In terms of religion today, that's a tougher conversation. And if anybody follows me on Twitter, and I don't know if anybody here does, I have a lot of tough conversations about religion on Twitter and what theology looks like, especially in public life and what that means. The global evangelical movement is much different than the evangelical movement in the United States. I'll start with that. The evangelical movement in the United States writ large, as we think of it generically, is a much more political movement than it is a theological movement. I consider myself an evangelical, but in a traditional sense, in that I believe that Christ is God. Christ took human form, came to earth, was persecuted, died on the cross, rose on the third day, and because of that, we have salvation. And I believe that Christ came, he saw, he died, and rose again. That's all you need to believe to be a Christian and to be an evangelical in a traditional sense. Much of this modern notion of Christianity and being an evangelical is trying to say this nicely. It became much more of a white nationalist oriented thing following the Civil War, especially in the South. And in fact, and during slavery. And in fact, the Southern Baptists and American Baptists, which used to be one Baptist convention, broke because of slavery prior to the Civil War. The Methodist Church had breaks in it prior to the Civil War. So this notion of trying to, that I always try to have a hard part explaining this because I always try to be very gentle with it, and maybe I should just put it out there. And so for me, I'm not surprised to see that there were people at the Capitol praying on January 6th, because that's always been a part of a certain brand of Christianity in this nation that has its roots in the fact that they use it to justify the treatment of Native people when they got here. They use it to justify slavery. So they created a Christianity that at its core had this notion that this one group of people was better than this other group of people because of skin color. So we've always had that. The virulent form that we know of today, and that I consider to be some very violent and cultural Christians, and not necessarily theologically Christian, they're the same folks we've been dealing with since the Civil Rights Movement. That Dr. King responded to in a letter from a Birmingham jail when he talks about when he talked to moderate Christians and moderate white folks in that famous section of the letter from the Birmingham jail. So when I look at what we have on January 6th as it relates to my faith and the people who claim to be Christian who are participating in that, is probably the modern example of the same folks who would have refused to teach slaves how to read. I mean, that's just the way it is. And they've sold their souls for the purpose of power. And if you know anything about the history of Baptist folks rejected the idea of power for power's sake. That's how we got the Baptist Church in the 1600s after Martin Luther and the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg Church door. Baptist folks believe that each person had to come to God in their own right and make their own decision, compared to the tradition of Luther and the Catholic Church, where you were born into a church community and you had no choice about it. And so the early Baptists broke off and they were oppressed, and they went to places like Rhode Island, which is basically a Baptist colony through Providence, so that they could have religious freedom and create a state where basic Baptist tenets could be lived out. And so that's why Rhode Island wasn't intended to have, that's why this notion of separation of church and state is so important. And I'm going on and on, so I'm going to stop here, because this is something I could probably talk about for an hour or two just on that.
Have to reunite for that. I'm thinking that before we get to questions, we might go to this whole thing that we started with on how do we live with our historical legacies. And I am wondering if there is something that the young folks joining us today might be planning to invent, because I do not know that their elders have figured this out. So we have statues. We do statues, and as a people, we have these bronze things that don't hold up so well and that have all kinds of complicated values, and sometimes they are knocked over and sometimes they are defended and so on. I'm not sure statues are a really great way of reckoning with historical legacy. I'm not sure that workshops and forums and the making of documentaries. I'm just thinking there's something in the way of human communication that we haven't figured out yet. And younger people might get that. How do we take these really difficult historical legacies and present them in ways that don't create fatalism, that don't create a sense of, oh boy, do we have a tough inheritance? How will we ever break through that? But really make a dynamic process of considering how to change it. And I've had ideas. I think my best idea was that when there is a controversy over history, young people are trained and organized as the equivalent of EMTs. And so some older people are all getting ready to quarrel and fight, and young people come racing in and they speak with tranquility about the historical story, and then they bring us into a conversation about how we live with that. All I know is that I haven't seen anything that I think, I mean, truth and reconciliation commissions, so we'd be doing that. Other nations, South Africa, other nations have certainly done that. There's a movement to have there's always been a movement in some ways to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Colorado over the the governor did apologize for the Sand Creek Massacre. That was an important thing. So I'm just asking the question because I don't quite know the answer. A public lecture. We did a program, the Senate American West did a program which Jeff and Rebecca Hunt participated in with the Stapleton neighborhood. We had called it Stapleton Reflection Day. We had some very fine historians talking about Stapleton. It was a good discussion afterwards. I think it helped in some ways with the longer process of changing that name. But is there something missing in our social and cultural, or maybe it's in our technology? How do we do the full reckoning with the difficult parts of history in a way that changes things and doesn't mean that we just do it again the next year?
By the way, could I jump in and recommend that everybody read Jeff and Rebecca's comment on the Great Awakening and religion in the comments section, because it's absolutely, spot on.
Yes, that's really important. Yeah. So I know we're, oh, well, there you are, the core of discovery. There's an idea. Okay. So what do you think about the what we have in the way of cultural ceremonies, rituals, ways of doing this really serious reckoning? Do we have that worked out? Do we have something that we're on the edge of figuring out about how to have those kinds of convenings with an outcome, and convenings that maybe have strategies for lowering defensiveness and denial in some of the participants? I don't know. What do you think? That's to you.
So me,
that is totally to you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was waiting for Emma, because you said young people, and I'm, now that I'm 52, I'm kind of, over the hill now.
That's gonna. I can just tell you that it's gonna get worse for you because I know a little bit about that. I know that. So, no, I was thinking we're about to shift over to the young people and the questions. So, but we have.
For me, I generally like the idea of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, but then I look at what happened in South Africa. I'm not sure how completely successful it was at the end of the day, but I only can say one thing, and I don't know how we play this out. This country is in need of some serious truth telling.
Mm-hmm. And the very notion of truth has gone rogue. We don't even have that word to say to each other.
That is true.
Oh, young people. Okay, so Celeste, should we shift to the questions?
Yes.
Conversation?
That's a very good idea. And boy, am I overwhelmed by this conversation. I wish we could keep talking and talking. But there are some questions that were in the chat that I want to make sure were answered. And it really, Terrence, what you guys were just talking about, the first question was right about the time when, Terrence, you were talking about the movie, Hunt movies, and about how how good, how much closer they were. How does the younger generation form their views of the Western experiences and relations? And I'm going to add to that to help to get more of an answer too. When I was in the classroom, I used to use, my kids would read an Eric Foner text, which is sort of a middle road, if you will. And then in the summer, I would ask them to read Howard Zinn, and Howard Zinn certainly goes way to the other direction. And then I would get chastised by folks for telling a truth that wasn't true. So I'm going to add that in. How do we get the younger generations? How do we help them form their views without those sort of chastisements? So that's for both of you.
Yeah. I like to always quote Sir Francis Bacon when asked that question. It's like it's my new jam now. It's to quote Francis Bacon, I don't know if someone asked him this question, but he says, and I'm paraphrasing, that people should read broadly, engage in dialogue, and write, because writing makes you exact. And so my basic answer in terms of how young people, form their thoughts and form their minds, I'm not going to tell anyone, how to think or how to be, but I do think it's important that, kind of give a roadmap on how you can inform your final decision points, which is by read a lot, engage in a lot of conversations, and then write a lot, because that writing makes you an exact person in your thinking. And so that's what I advise young people to do, because I actually have a lot of friends who have different political and religious better person overall, is that me as a thinker is informed by them as a thinker, and we inform each other, and our iron sharpens iron, which makes us better. So that's where I land on this.
I'm going to shift to the fact that I know nothing about how the younger generation forms their view of the Western experiences and relations. I know there are these things. There's that, for a while, there was the Oregon Trail game that's gone now, but I guess they're trying to revive that. There's Red Dead Redemption or whatever. There's video games. There's, who knows? I mean, I am really out of my league when it comes to that. I don't know where that would take whatever the form of cultural engagement and raising of curiosity about history. I don't know anything about how video games might shape a drive to do more research. I particularly don't know if it's the kind of historical exploration. Core of Discovery is there. If it's the kind of exploration that would cause a force of young people to enter American society and say, take this seriously, take history seriously, reflect on it, pull from the past inspirational lessons and cautionary lessons. So I have no idea what is the and you have a better idea probably, Celeste, and I'd imagine that the young people have the best idea of all what is going on with the installation of historical thinking in the minds of the under 25 crowd.
Yeah, I'm around them. I'm the oldest person in my office by a good bit, and I work with. The average age of a staff member at Unite America is 30. Actually, that's younger than 30. It's about 26, 27, and so it's my place of being all the time. And one thing I've learned over the year and a half that I've been there and working with them. Is that my colleagues are hungry for hearing a long historical view on things. And I just started for our interns, they asked if I would do a week, I don't even know what we're calling it. We're having a weekly or monthly thought session where we just think about things. And the interns came to me and said, hey, could we do this thing with you every month where you find an article and we go through the article? So I'm finding that that generation really wants to engage with folks who are older than them in dialogue about things that have happened and how they can form their thoughts. And I was actually surprised by that because I hadn't been around a lot of folks who were 20 something in recent years, because I've been hiding out in the Hobbit. My house, that's what I call it, the Hobbit. So I've been hiding out there a lot, but I've been surprised that, you know, that group, that generation is really interested in re-engaging with an older generation. But I've also learned that from that, I took that group for granted in terms of their commitment to engaging in serious thought, serious critical thought. And so that's been a highlight of my year and a half where I am now, and gives me a lot of hope for the younger generations that they're engaging more deeply than I think people realize.
That's really great.
Are any of the young people here tonight willing to tackle that question?
Great question, Rebecca. Thank you. Emma?
Yeah, sure. So I think I actually agree. I think there's a shocking amount of people around my age who are really interested in history. And things like that. Like, I've met quite a few people who really want to learn about things. And I know that you generally kind of see kind of the narrative that's around it is that, like, we focus on our phones and stuff, and we're not necessarily as interested in learning and things like that as people were in the past. But I think that at least in the last couple of years, specifically since 2016, there's been a massive spike in a lot of students really wanting to learn more about history. And I just see so much more of it, this kind of want for education with surrounding it and this caring about it. And I think because it ties so heavily into our political present about what's happening with our current political climate, that you see a lot of students who are really concerned about that, who are getting focused in history because they feel like turning to historical events will help solve the problems that we have today. And so I think that there's at least in the last few years been a huge rise in students being really interested in studying about that stuff. And I think it's more important to them now than it was in the past.
Thanks. Thank you, Emma. I'm gonna do an old teacher thing. I'm gonna call on two of the students who are here to address Patty and Terrence and answer Rebecca's question. Nina and Catherine live in very rural areas in the state. Nina's in the far southwest corner, and Catherine's actually close to me where I am right now. And they have shared with the board with the student board, some of their experiences that, you know, would fit Terrence's idea.
All I hear is
So let's be.
Can you hear me?
that's the whole backdrop of you that you have is really spooky. Just saying.
I know, I'm sorry. I'm in a hallway where the only plug-in is, and so there's a light.
I think she's frozen now.
Okay.
Well, there's the point. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay,
That's-
sorry. My internet is very unstable, and I know it. I feel spooky. I feel like I'm in some sort of surreal thing. I'm in a hallway and there's only one light and I'm right underneath it, but it's the only place to plug in. I was pointing out Nina and Catherine, you both live in places that would support what Terrence was saying earlier. Can you talk to that? I'm putting you on the spot.
So I think while we're waiting for some kind of miracle to occur there I'm just going to ask these questions because I've been typing them in there about whether the members of the student advisory board here, and this is building, I said Emma's question, but I meant to say Emma's comment. How can young people play the history card to get better behavior from their elders? Because to some degree, the contentiousness does seem to be not coming from people under 30 having shouting matches and fighting with each other in various ways. I'm just wondering if there's a way in which that playing the history card on your elders might actually disarm them and make them behave better, or invite them to behave better. So I just was wondering if that might be a line of thought that might be why you were serving on the student advisory board, because you were seeing ways in which you can really take this as a place to say to your elders, not grow up, that wouldn't be the right thing to say, but just get past the crabbiness, just get past the polarization. Why don't you all just do that? Because here's the historical examples that will help you do that. So I don't know, just a thought, wondering about that. But now, Celeste, you think you're back in? Is that right?
I think I am. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, much better.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I moved away from that light, so I hope it looks better. Patty, that's a very good point. I mean, I think that I've heard Nina and Catherine, and I want to try to get them to be able to speak. Catherine, you may have to take yourself off video to be able to talk, but I want to talk to them because I've actually heard Nina say things along what you just said, that it's time to tell grownups to grow up. So Nina, it's on you.
Nina?
Well, I feel like in my area, there's not a lot of people who are like really interested in history. And so like, I don't know, I feel like I'm really lucky to have NHD as like a way for me to connect with other people who are interested in history. But to just answer the question of like, if I use history to like get people to behave better, I do I do like to call out like my relatives if they're like, I don't know, and just like, I don't know, like I reference points in history to like get them to see from a different perspective maybe.
Great. Yay, there goes the EMTs out there with their, it's actually emergency history technicians, I guess it's, so EHTs for that, that's fine. Dream. So Nina, that seems great. How do they take that?
Sometimes they take it okay, and then sometimes they just tell me that I'm too young to get anything, so, you know.
Okay.
Catherine, what are your thoughts?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, going back to what Mr. Carroll was saying, in my area, at least in my group of people that I'm around, I find that we are all very, very engaged in what has happened before us, specifically because of what is happening to us now. And I also think it comes from, in the age we are in, we are constantly getting pulled millions of different directions through devices, that having those meaningful face-to-face, true factual conversations is really important to us. And then going to using history to encourage our elders to be more polite to each other. I am a strong believer that knowledge is power. And the more I seem to learn, the better I can approach my elders who learned much different facts than I have, in a way that can hopefully open their minds to the world we live in today.
Great.
So Clark is asking a great question. I don't know if anybody has seen it. And Catherine, I think you inspired it. Does asking questions of elders about their own personal histories work as a way of getting them to open up? How many of you have done that for your projects of the students you're on? Michaela and Alec, I thought, haven't you done that before?
Do you mean like interview? Like,
Yeah,
Oh yeah, definitely. I know last year, um, we actually went to, after we won the competition, we went to this Lincoln Highway, museum, and, there was a guy who had like, who became really interested in Lincoln Highway, and it was going to be like a quick stop just because we were taking the Lincoln Highway back home. But he was so eager to talk about like different artifacts that he had, um, and just how it related to today and the highway system today. And I don't know, it just kind of lit him up just talking about what he knew and the history. Michaela, do you have anything to say?
I can say as the person who got to be the MC of that thing, the Lincoln Highway project was really cool. That was really, really good. So I'll just add my elderly.
Well, I will tell you that Alec and Michaela and their triplet, their third, were the grand nationals for their documentary this year. And so that's the project they're talking about. And they did a fantastic job. Michaela says she's going to type in, and we have somebody saying, I think most people like to talk about their past experiences. Boy, is that ever true. Oh, Clark, that's a great question.
A couple of years ago,
Go ahead, Emma.
oh, sorry. Okay, I was just going to say that I volunteered at the Molly Brown House really prominently, and a couple of years ago, I was working on designing an exhibit about when the house was a halfway house for teenage girls. And we really didn't have any information on it other than knowing from the neighbors about it from when we started restoring the house. And so I was doing a bunch of research, going down to the library and stuff, and I dug up some information about the guy who founded the Halfway House Project. This guy, Judge Ted Rubin, and I got to go up with the curator and have an interview with him because he's had this amazing like hour and a half long interview with him just about his role in the juvenile justice system in Colorado and how he was like, this project was really revolutionary in a lot of ways, even though it was only around for a few years. But it was just really, really cool to get to hear from someone who was so passionate about what they were talking about and who could give us like the most accurate perspective on something that had happened that we didn't even know about before. So it was really amazing.
I'm going to selfishly take the conversation back to something Terrence, you and that Terrence and Patty were talking about, because I think this is an attempt at a hopeful way to end. You guys were talking about truth and reconciliation. You can't hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
You're in and out.
Okay, sorry. Can you talk more? I think a good way would be to talk about the truth and reconciliation ideas you guys were bringing up. Is there a possibility for that happening? And would it work? I mean, Terrence, you bring up South Africa, and did it work? We thought it did, but then it didn't. And what about Australia? And is there a way? My husband's family were part of the Trail of Tears. And so I wonder, you know, what's it going to take for them to feel like they've been heard? So, you know, all those things, what is that a possibility for our nation? Doesn't feel like it right now.
I read 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I read Bishop Tutu. I read histories of the South African. Well, they were just happening at the time, so it would be quite histories. It was very remarkable. I was astounded with the relationship with other who were speaking to each other, and I don't know. I guess nobody quite knows whether some of the people who had engaged in violent activity towards others, if they were pretending to take part in that, so that they would be off the hook, so they could be seen as having asked for forgiveness and absolution or something. I don't know, but it seemed I found it very moving, and I was really struck by some of the stories, but I'm with Terrence on the, I don't know, South Africa. It didn't really, whatever it was I thought had been achieved in reading about that, it didn't seem, it seems like my hopes were too high on that. And I don't know how you, it seems like right now we have the people who are the insurrectionists at the Capitol are not interested in a heart-to-heart talk. That seems like, I don't know how you would get them. And I'm not sure how much I would participate in a heart-to-heart talk with the people who took over the Capitol. And well, I don't know. So I assume that that we don't have Nelson Mandela. I assume that must be part of it, or Bishop Tutu, that we lack some of the, so I'm trying not to be gloomy in front of young people. That's why I keep shifting around here. And so what do you think, Terrence? I mean, the one thing I would say that we never get to start any of our secular things with the prayer. We have to, when we gather as secular people, and we're all supposed to be secular, we never get to go out of our framework of this secular moment and say, we ask for help from a larger force. Gathering, if you can't have some version of that, if you can't have some way of saying, we can't, the Declaration is so clearly written by men who were slaveholders that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I mean, we can't even say that without thinking, those are the slaveholders. So we don't have that way that I could see yet of how to say, come out of this moment and think of a deeper, more intense framework than what we have. So I should stop saying depressing things to young people. I'm just gonna quit with that. Yeah. So,
Well, I'll be very quick since I know we're at the 7:30 hour and I have to eat at some point as well today. I think there needs to be some process for truth telling. I don't know what it looks like, but I do know that it requires that we have a common set of facts, a common narrative that we're working from about what we want to be as a nation and where we want to be. I also believe that it requires people who are central and core to the process to have a strong moral bearing and project moral leadership, because I think that's something that the country is lacking right now. So I think that's required. And as I've been saying a lot lately, I think it requires hard conversations. And I'll put my preacher hat on for a minute. One of the things that makes the gospel so amazing is that the gospel calls all of us to have hard conversations with ourselves about who we are as human beings and how we interact with the rest of the world and with each other. And I think that's a reason why Jesus said they shall know us by our love. And that requires you and us and individually and collectively to show our love to other people. Even if it involves a hard conversation, it can still be done in love with respect, grace, and mercy. And that's all I have for you.
that seems good.
That's a lot. A huge, and Patty, do you have a final thought, a final word?
I guess what I'm struck by in my own attitudes here is that I am naive, which I wasn't planning to be at this advanced age. But I teamed out a course 20 years ago with the African historian and the Middle Eastern historian on colonialism and imperialism in the American West and parts of the Middle East and parts of Africa. And I think the historians of Africa and the Middle East were kind of amazed that I was as naive as I was. So, for instance, Lord Cromer in Egypt was that British guy taking over Egypt, and he was forever saying that he had to take control of Egypt and rule over Egypt because Egyptian women were oppressed. He would often say that. Then, of course, in England and Britain, he was an opponent of women's suffrage. So we'd hear something like that where a man took this supposed principled stance of looking out for Egyptian women and then clearly had no desire to look out for the rights of women in Britain. And I would think, that's terrible. That's so contradictory. I can't believe that happened. And the Middle Eastern historian and the African historian would just kind of look at me with a sort of, really? You're surprised by that? So I think I'm still working on the naivete thing, because there is nothing in history that says that if everyone, it's not Tinkerbell, we'll just all clap our hands and we'll get it back on better shape here. And I don't know if Tinkerbell has any bearing on this, but it just seems like I am still hoping for something that history does not confirm, that we are going to behave well to each other. And so, do I know? I have seen wonderful conduct from time to time in people that just makes me think this could happen. Enemies reconciling, people having bitter quarrels and then going out for dinner afterwards. I don't know. I think there's plenty of examples of people making a peace with each other, but I'm not sure that history totally validates that hope. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that it's just, or it just lays out our challenges so that we can take them on more effectively. Maybe that's what it is.
Thank you. Thank you both. Can everybody hear me? I hope, because I really want to say thank you. Terrence and Patty, thank you. And Terrence, I wish you didn't have to eat, because I would love to ask you about a zillion more questions. So expect some private messages. Patty, I love talking to you and you know that, so expect the same. We appreciate everybody. This has been amazing. What a great way to kick off. We'll post that we've been recording, and so we'll post a recording on our website. Anybody have one last parting word? Clark, thank you for your questions. Rebecca and Jeff, thank you for your questions. It is great to have historians, additional historians in the room. Margie, thanks for you being here. Thanks to everybody. Anybody want to have one last big thing? Emma, thank you. And I apologize again for the instability. This is the road. When one is on the road for contest season, and this weekend is our first contest, this is what it's like. So to my right is Ed Crowther, who has been a long historian and will be conducting the History Day contest in Alamosa. We're doing it remote this year from my brother's home in Buena Vista. So it is a weird, weird year. Anybody have one last word?
Just the one that I always say, Celeste, what you do is remarkable. What you and your team and the young folks do, it's so inspirational. It really, 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 it's just, it gets me over my crabby, or not crabby, but my disappointed and disillusioned fits. All I just think about what Celeste and her team were doing at History Day, and I think, well, okay then. We're moving on.
And I just want to thank you for the opportunity to put a sport coat and a button-down shirt over my sweatpants today.
Okay, so Terrence, you forced me to say this will be a fun way to part. Terrence, thank you for saying that, because one of our board members is Senator Bennett, and earlier this year we always have a forum with him when the kids are competing, and so it was time for the town hall, and I was about an hour before, and I had so much work to do, and I had to decide, do I take a shower and get dressed, or do I just put a sweatshirt on over my PJs? And so now I have the ability to say that I conducted a senatorial town hall with Senator Michael Bennett in my pajamas. I will always be able to say that. And so Terrence, thank you for giving me permission to say that. All right, well, thank you everybody.
Thank you guys so much for coming. This was amazing.
Right.
Thank you.
Margie?
And we hope you guys can make it to the next one.
Thank you all.
Margie,
bye. Thank you guys so much.
Bye everybody, thank you.
Margie, can you hang on for a second?
If I leave, if I go, do I need to stay on for you and Margie to have a conversation?
No, not necessarily.
So I can leave?
Yeah.
I just don't want to butt in on your conversation. It's good to see you guys. Hey, Rebecca,
Yeah.
you have some mail. Do you want me to mail? I'm happy to mail it to you.
I'll figure out how to get it. It's not anything that I desperately need.
I think it's just some journals because it's like packaging.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll figure out how to get there.
All right. Bye, you
Okay,
guys.
thanks, Celeste.
Sure.
Margie, we're wondering if